Okay, so the first presentation, the first episode you watched have sort of, we're into the war now, right? The presentation was sort of about some of the long-term origins and some of the short-term causes. Um, the documentary episode, I think, gave you a lot of good detail about what's going on in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and in the Balkans. Remember, the Ottoman Empire, just to sort of set up the dynamic here, the Ottoman Empire is collapsing. In the late 17th century, 1600s, the Ottoman Empire is moving closer and closer into the heartland of Europe. They're on the doorstep of Vienna. They're defeated in the 17th century. Ottoman Empire at that point is one of the most powerful entities in the world. But ever since then, they've been in sort of retreat. They've been retreating for 2 centuries, slowly. It's been very slowly. As they fall back, there's all these skirmishes to sort of take, because there's that vacuum, right? Sorry, clock is ringing. The Russians, the Austrians, the English, all sorts of people are in here vying to sort of take up that land. The Serbs are related ethnically to the Russians. They speak the same language. Many of them are Eastern Orthodox Christians, like the Russians. The Serbs fight against the Ottomans as the Ottomans are sort of collapsing, and there is created a kingdom of Serbia. However, there are Serbs across the border, basically, who are still being controlled by the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire is sort of called the dual monarchy at this point, but the emperor is still Austrian. There is a king who is Hungarian. The Hungarians are large enough that they were sort of able to get some political concessions from the Austrians so that they can rule themselves a little bit. But there's a whole lot of other ethnic groups that aren't ruling themselves. The Magyars. There are Italians who are still in the Austria. There is an Italy now, and they want to be part of that Italy, and they don't want to move, right? They want the border to come to them. There are Serbs. There are Slovaks. There are Croats. There are all these different people who sometimes are of different religions, certainly speak different languages, and they want to have their own country, right? That's nationalism, essentially, right? That's the real sort of probably the most important long-term cause here. Okay, this next section, the episodes and the presentation, are going to take you from the beginning of the war in sort of late summer 1914 to late winter, early spring 1917. Okay, so about 2.5 years. That's when the U.S. gets into the war. And that's when this next unit will go to that point, and then the last will sort of go from spring 1917 to the armistice in 1918, about a year and a half. The important thing to keep in mind here is that I'm going to talk a lot about the first months of the war, because by November, or probably really September 1914, the battle lines are sort of set, and they will move, but they don't move much. But the first few months of the war, there's in fact a lot of movement, right? We always think of trench warfare in 1914 or in World War I, which there's a good reason, because essentially from October 1914 to the end, it is trench warfare. But the first few months, there's actually a ton of movement. The Germans invade, or the Germans, we've already talked about the Schlieffen Plan. I'm just going to review a little bit here. The Germans were sort of terrified when the French and the Russians signed their peace treaty. They did not think that would happen, right? Russia is still an absolute monarch with a czar at the helm, with the idea being that the czar has been chosen by God, so it's still sort of an absolute, divine monarch. Czar is Russian for Caesar, basically. Well, not basically, it is. France, since 1871, since their loss in the Franco-Prussian War, is a republic, and it is probably the most democratic. Yeah, it is the most democratic nation in Europe, in the world. Probably, sort of tied maybe with the United States. All men can vote. Women can't vote. In fact, women can't vote to France till 1945, after World War II. But all men can vote. There's no property requirements. Church and state are separate by law. The French Third Republic is, again, the most democratic of any institution. Russia is probably the least democratic in Europe of any nation, though they have nothing in common. So the Germans know this, and the Germans think, look, they'll never get together. They really don't like each other very much. They fought against each other in the middle of the 19th century in the Crimean War, but they do because both are so worried about the Germans. When they sign that peace treaty, the German high command goes to one of their generals, Schlieffen, von Schlieffen. Von means he was an aristocrat from, essentially, They go to him and they say, look, we may have to fight a two-front war against the French and against the Russians. How do we do it? Schlieffen comes up with this plan. This is his plan. Send just enough troops to the east against Russia to hold them. In 6 months, our forces might collapse. But the idea is you hold the Russians for 6 months, you send a lot more units to the west, and you knock out the French very quickly. Once you're done knocking them out, then the entire army can go attack the Russians. The Russian army, they figured, is going to be pretty slow to mobilize, but it's enormous. So the idea is we can probably hold them for a few months with not a lot of our military. Knock out the French, and then we can fight. Then you were just fighting one war against the Russians. That's Schlieffen's idea. He didn't necessarily think it would work. It was the only chance. He said, this is the only chance we got. I'm not sure it'll even be successful, but here it is. That's the plan in 1914 that the Germans put into effect. In fact, it doesn't work. It may have worked, but there's several things that happen that sort of add to it not working. First, the English joined the war. The Germans had always suspected or thought that the English wouldn't actually fight. The English are in an alliance with the French and the Russians, but if you speak any French, entente means understanding. Meaning the English essentially say, we have an understanding that we'll probably come to your aid if the Germans attack. The English can always not, and the Germans think that they won't. They think that if we invade the French really quickly and things are looking good for us, the English will say, look, we don't want to get involved in the continent. We have this channel, separating us from what's going on. We don't care. The English do join the war. 2, the Germans suspected that the Belgians would probably they were going to invade Belgium. That the Belgians would just sort of let them go through. The Belgians don't. The Belgians, in fact, do try to fight the Germans. It doesn't slow them down a lot, but a little bit. The third element probably is that the story goes that when Schlieffen's on his deathbed, he had died, but he wasn't alive in 1914. The last thing he said was, keep the right flank strong. Those of you if you've served in the military, if you know anything about military tactics, you basically try to outflank your enemy. That's standard military procedure. It still is, and it's been for 200 years. Well, yeah, 200 years. The idea is that, you sort of attack your enemy head on, but you have troops that come from one side or the other, and as they get into the sort of rear, as they disrupt communications and supply lines, the entire thing then sort of collapses. That's the Schlieffen plan. You attack the French at the German-French border, but hopefully the French won't know for a while, and the Germans will be moving too fast for the French to really do anything about it. You sweep through Belgium, and you basically, you sort of attack. Maybe you get to the channel, and then you basically sort of sweep it down. That's the plan. For that plan to work, you can actually get defeated or even be pushed back a little bit where you're sort of attacking through the French border. That's okay. But every unit further out has to move quicker than the others, right? This is sort of a simple, if you have a protractor, you can sort of, right, that the units on the farthest out have to actually be moving faster. If that arm, it can get a few kinks in it, but if it gets too many, that's my son who's just, I don't know if you heard that, but he's apparently tearing his room apart. A few chinks in the armor, but the further out you get, the more imperative is that they are successful. At the last minute, the German high command gets nervous about the number of troops they're sending to fight the Russians. They think it's not enough. Because if you can't at least stop the Russians, well, this is all for naught. The Russians will be in Berlin perhaps in no time, right? So last second, the German high command pulls a couple of armies from that are supposed to be doing this pincer movement. They pull them out of there and send them east to fight the Russians. Now we don't know if them being there would have made the Schlieffen Plan work. Maybe it still would have failed, but it does fail, and it fails at the first battle of the Marne at the Marne River, where the French and the English are able to stop the Germans. Now the first battle of the Marne is a draw, right? The Germans aren't defeated. The French and the English just stopped them, but we now can probably say that was a defeat for the Germans, and it probably lost them the war. The Germans had, for them to win World War I shouldn't say had. They really probably needed the Schlieffen Plan to work to have any chance in World War I. The Germans are fighting the English, the French, the Russians, the Italians in a little bit, the Serbs, the Americans in 2.5 years. You say, what about the Austrians? Yes, the Austrians are a pretty large entity, but the Austrian-Hungarian Empire is, in fact, collapsing almost when World War I begins. The Ottoman Empire is also a very large still entity. They're also on the German and the Austrian side. They are also sort of collapsing, though. The Germans are really, holding this entire war effort up, and they just can't do it. Again, Schlieffen said, we got one chance to win. This is the plan. I'm not sure it will work, but this is it. The Schlieffen Plan fails. And it makes you wonder, why don't the Germans then sort of try to get out of the war? They had one shot and it failed. Because war is always one of the reasons is war is always political. People want to say we should get politics. It always is. And it's very difficult to go to your people and say, look, we probably can't win this. Let's get out of it. That's an answer to a question that people really, their minds might explode like the guy in Scanners if they heard it, right? If we lose, not that that's as we lose, but how we don't know that. And they say no. All of our strategists are saying this. Well, you can't sort of accept that. You say no, you just got to do it anyway. And the other case is that, in fact, in the East, which the Germans were just supposed to hold, the Russian army fights so poorly that, in fact, the Germans are having some victories in the East. And that's the other thing. So the Germans are able to sort of go to send news reports home and say, look, the West, we're holding our own. It's a stalemate in the West, but we're winning in the East. That looks like a win, right? It's a tie in the East, or tie in the West, but we're winning in the East. That's pretty good. Again, what the sort of German high command, some of them know is, that's not good enough, essentially. That wasn't the plan, and the Russian army is too large. Now, the Russian army will fight so poorly that actually it does give Germany a chance, so you can make that case too. Okay, next time I'll talk to you will be in spring 1917, or early spring, late winter 1917. Thanks.